I mean, Ringo was like a professional musician. So Ringo sat in, and I remember the moment.
At 82, Paul McCartney has finally broken decades of silence, and what he just revealed about Ringo Starr is sending shockwaves through Beatles fans everywhere. For years, the two were seen as brothers in rhythm, bound by music and memories. But behind the fame, the albums, and the carefully curated interviews, something deeper was unraveling. What he's exposed will change how you see their friendship, their music, and the legacy of the Beatles forever. Join us as we uncover shocking details that will leave you speechless. By 1966, the Beatles were no longer just a band. They were a global obsession. Cities shut down for their arrival. Security lines snapped under the pressure, and fans screamed so loud the music was barely audible on stage. It was chaos, but to Paul McCartney every detail mattered. Every missed beat and every lost second felt like a threat to the empire they'd built. And that's when Paul started noticing something. Ringo Starr was slipping out of sync, not in tempo, but in commitment. At first it was small, missed phone calls, late arrivals to rehearsals, less eye contact during performances. Ringo always had a casual air, but during their final tour that summer, Paul sensed something different. In Chicago, a delay before the show had Paul pacing, while Ringo sat in silence, unmoved. In Memphis, Paul allegedly panicked when Ringo disappeared just hours before soundcheck. No one knew where he was. When he finally turned up, he acted like nothing had happened. He cracked a joke, tuned his kit, and went on like it was a regular Tuesday. But for Paul, that wasn't okay. Behind the scenes, he was furious. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. Paul had a different weapon, ice-cold control. One of the Beatles' studio assistants later recalled that after that show, Paul refused to speak to Ringo for nearly 48 hours. He rerouted rehearsals. He played drums during a sound check, something he'd rarely done in public, to prove he could keep the rhythm if needed. People close to the band say it wasn't just about music, it was about control. Paul needed to believe that every piece of the machine worked flawlessly, and in that moment, Ringo looked like a loose screw. Even more troubling was Ringo's attitude. He wasn't confrontational, but he wasn't apologetic either. He shrugged things off, deflected with humor, and when Paul tried to discuss logistics, Ringo changed the subject. That only made things worse. Paul, the planner, hated vagueness, and now he had to deal with a drummer who seemed to float through critical moments without anchoring to the urgency. This is when the shift really started. He was rewriting the band's structure in his head, and that growing control would soon become a major problem, not just with Ringo, but with everyone. To outsiders, the Beatles looked like brothers, but Paul started seeing something else. John was already drifting into his own world. George was pushing Eastern music and growing more defiant. And Ringo? He was still smiling, still showing up, but Paul wasn't sure he was really in it anymore. The final concert in San Francisco that August would be their last public show as a band. The screaming fans, the helicopters, the flashing cameras, it all came to a close. And while the world mourned the end of live Beatles shows, Paul was already grieving something else. The trust was fading. He no longer believed they were a team. Ringo had become a question mark, and Paul McCartney hated question marks. And what started on stage didn't stay there, because when they returned to the studio, Paul would find even more reasons to doubt him. The Beatles' final tour in 1966 was supposed to be their grand farewell to the road. But behind the flashing lights and deafening crowds, something darker was brewing. Paul McCartney was watching everything, every mistake, every offbeat, and every time someone wasn't fully locked in. And the one person he kept noticing wasn't quite there: Ringo Starr. To the public, Ringo was the easygoing one, always smiling, cracking jokes, keeping the peace. But Paul saw something else during that tour. He saw someone drifting quietly, and in Paul's eyes, that wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. There were nights, according to insiders, when Paul was pacing backstage, waiting for everyone to arrive at rehearsals. George was there. John was probably smoking in a corner, brooding. But Ringo? Sometimes he just wasn't around, just a shrug when he walked in. That casualness, that looseness, it rubbed Paul the wrong way, and it started showing in how he treated Ringo. One story from their 1966 Memphis show still floats around today. According to crew members, Paul completely lost his temper when Ringo disappeared before soundcheck. He wasn't missing for hours, just long enough to make Paul panic. When Ringo returned, cool as ever, Paul didn't even speak to him. Not that night. Not the next morning either. The tension was thick, and no one dared to bring it up. This wasn't about one gig. For Paul, it was bigger than that. The Beatles weren't just a band, they were the biggest musical force on the planet, and the fact that Ringo didn't seem to treat it that way made Paul question him. In the studio, Paul was already taking over, not just writing melodies but orchestrating entire sessions. If a song needed bass, he played it. If the guitar part wasn't quite right, he stepped in. And when the drums didn't hit how he wanted, he'd do it himself. During the recording of Back in the USSR, Ringo walked out after feeling criticized too many times. Paul didn't wait. He sat behind the kit and laid the track down himself. When Ringo came back, his drum set was covered in flowers, a gesture from George and Paul to smooth things over. But the damage had been done. Ringo may have smiled, but Paul had made his point. If you're not dialed in, I'll do it without you. That moment wasn't just about drums. It was about control. Paul had always been driven, but by the mid-60s he was gripping the reins so tightly that even a second of unpredictability set him off. And Ringo, always the chill, always the one to go with the flow, was starting to feel like a liability. Not because he wasn't talented. Ringo had impeccable timing, a unique feel, and an instinct for restraint. But Paul wasn't looking for feel. He was looking for precision, and anything short of perfection became personal. Ringo, for his part, never made a scene. He didn't fight Paul publicly. He didn't argue in interviews or storm out of the band entirely. That wasn't his style. Ringo grew quieter, more withdrawn. He came in, did his parts, and left. No lingering, no laughs. Paul noticed. He felt the distance growing, but he didn't address it. He just doubled down. More control, more takes, more pressure. By the end of the 1966 tour, the Beatles were exhausted. They played their last show at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29th. When they walked off stage, none of them knew it would be the final concert they'd ever play together as a full band. Paul, as usual, was thinking ahead. The studio, new albums, film projects. But something was missing. The magic wasn't effortless anymore. And in his mind, part of that was because not everyone was holding the line. He never said Ringo's name out loud in those conversations. But people close to the band said Paul's eyes gave it away. The frustration, the disappointment, the silent calculation of who he could really count on moving forward. Even after the touring stopped, Paul kept feeling that same uncertainty. Ringo was loyal, yes, but he wasn't always present. Not in the way Paul needed, and that insecurity, that small crack, would grow into something bigger over the next few years. Because this wasn't just about disappearing before a show or missing a cue. To Paul McCartney, it was about commitment and passion. And when he didn't see that fire in Ringo anymore, something between them quietly broke. And the next time it shattered, it wouldn't be backstage. It would be in the middle of the Beatles' most chaotic recording sessions ever, and the fallout would leave scars that never quite healed. In early 1968, the Beatles did something no one expected. They vanished from the public eye and flew thousands of miles to a remote ashram in Rishikesh, India. The goal? Spiritual clarity, peace, a break from fame. But behind the stillness and meditation, a deeper fracture was forming. One that would pull Paul and Ringo even further apart. The retreat was supposed to reset the band. George Harrison had been pushing the group toward Eastern spirituality for years. He believed meditation might calm the disturbance that fame had brought. Paul agreed, at least on paper, but not everyone felt the same, especially Ringo. From the very first day, Ringo looked out of place. He didn't like the food. No meat, no familiar flavors. He didn't like the insects. And he definitely didn't like the sleeping arrangements. While the others were settling in, Ringo was counting the days. He brought a suitcase full of baked beans and tea bags from England, his own backup plan in case the food didn't work. That alone should have signaled something. He wasn't mentally committed. He wasn't there for the journey. He was there out of obligation. Within 10 days, Ringo packed his bags and left. To McCartney, the trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a test. A chance to reconnect with each other away from studios, managers, and screaming fans. And Ringo quitting so early? That felt like giving up. It also cemented a pattern. Paul began leaning more on himself, becoming increasingly self-reliant. If the band fell apart, he wanted to be the one holding it together. Ringo's early exit in India didn't just mark the end of the trip, it marked the beginning of Paul's quiet withdrawal from his bandmates. And while the world still saw four lads from Liverpool, Paul saw something else. Ringo might have seemed happy and harmless to the outside world, but to Paul, he was now a variable he couldn't fully trust. But the worst was still to come, because in the cold light of the studio, the tension didn't fade. It exploded, and Paul's resentment? That was just starting to take shape. Once the Beatles returned from India, whatever calm they'd hoped to find was gone. The studio became a war zone disguised as a recording session. Ideas clashed, egos flared, and old loyalties started to collapse. At the center of it all stood Paul McCartney, driven, restless, obsessively focused. And right behind him, in the shadows of mounting pressure, was Ringo Starr, quietly absorbing the fallout. But Paul wasn't just writing music anymore. He was rewriting the rules. And for Ringo, that meant being pushed to the edge. In the early days, Paul had relied on Ringo's drumming to shape the band's sound. Ringo wasn't flashy, but he was rock solid. He knew when to push and when to pull back. But by 1968, Paul wasn't satisfied with solid. That's exactly what happened during the White Album sessions. Tensions were already running high. John was distracted by Yoko. George was growing more frustrated with being ignored. And Paul, he was doing everything. He was writing songs, directing arrangements, layering harmonies, even playing instruments that weren't his, including Ringo's. Ringo wasn't lazy, he wasn't uninterested, but he didn't obsess over every note the way Paul did. He played from the gut, not a notebook. And to Paul, that looseness felt like a threat. He couldn't control it, so he replaced it. And it didn't stop there. On later albums, Paul continued stepping over boundaries. On The Ballad of John and Yoko, it's just Paul and John. Paul plays bass, piano, and drums. No Ringo, no George. It wasn't meant as an insult, but it landed like one. Ringo was still in the band, but his presence was becoming optional. In interviews years later, Paul softened the story. He said they were just working quickly, filling in parts to get things done. But the subtext was hard to miss. Paul didn't need anyone to finish a Beatles song, not even Ringo. By the time they recorded Abbey Road, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. The smiles in promo photos looked forced. The chemistry on tape was polished but strained. And underneath it all, Paul was carrying a silent frustration, a belief he never said out loud, but lived out in action. If I don't control this, it will fall apart. And that belief cost him more than control. It cost him connection. Because Ringo hadn't just been the drummer, he'd been a brother, a balancing force. And now, that balance was gone. But the most personal blow, the one that Paul never truly got over, was still on the horizon. Because what happened after the Beatles split would turn quiet tension into open wounds. And this time, the damage would be public and permanent. After years of making music that defined a generation, the Beatles found themselves tangled in something far uglier than any studio argument: business. And for Paul McCartney, the collapse of Apple Corps wasn't just the end of a dream, it was a betrayal, one that struck him right in the chest. Because the man who helped deliver the final blow wasn't John, it wasn't George, it was Ringo Starr. The cracks turned into a full-blown disaster in 1970 when Paul made a decision that would shake the entire foundation. He sued the other Beatles, not out of greed, but to legally dissolve the band and regain control over his share of the group. He claimed it was the only way to protect the music and prevent Klein from running their empire into the ground. The headlines were explosive, fans were horrified, and for the first time, the world saw Paul as the villain. But behind closed doors, the real pain came from who delivered the papers. It was Ringo. Paul later admitted it felt like a knife to the back. Of all people, Ringo had been the one who physically brought the documents to his house. The drummer who'd once been the heart of the band, the calming voice in the storm, was now the messenger of legal war. Ringo, for his part, didn't see it that way. In later interviews, he said he was just doing what needed to be done, that it wasn't about loyalty, it was about practicality. The fallout left scars. Paul withdrew. He focused on his solo work, built wings with Linda, and surrounded himself with people he could trust. But even in his happiest moments, the bitterness lingered. The image of Ringo handing him those legal documents haunted him. The legal battles dragged on for years. Paul eventually won the right to dissolve the Beatles as a business partnership, but the damage to Paul and Ringo's relationship was harder to repair. The bond they once shared, one built in vans, dressing rooms, and long studio nights, had been broken not with words, but with paperwork. And though time would eventually soften the edges, the betrayal left a quiet wound, one that neither of them would ever fully talk about. Because how do you explain the moment your brother became a stranger? Paul never forgot it. He never brought it up again in public. But every so often, when someone would ask about the band's breakup, you could see it in his eyes. He didn't just lose a band, he lost Ringo. And from that moment on, even when they smiled on stage or hugged for the cameras, something between them remained unfinished, waiting, perhaps, for one final conversation. In the immediate years after the breakup, Paul was busy reinventing himself. He launched Wings, poured his grief into songwriting, and focused on building something that felt like his own. Ringo also began his solo career, less ambitious, more playful. His albums had charm and personality, and he even scored a few hits. But as they both moved forward, their relationship stalled. At first, it was just awkward distance. They didn't call, they didn't visit, their paths rarely crossed, but that distance soon turned into resentment, and Paul's comments over the years began painting a picture that hinted at how he really felt. Paul buried it in work. He kept touring, writing, releasing albums. He celebrated John's legacy, praised George's genius, but rarely spoke about Ringo, and when he did, it always felt carefully scripted, like he was trying not to say too much. Ringo, too, gave occasional praise. He'd call Paul a great songwriter, say he was proud of their legacy, but he never got personal, never talked about what they were like together, never told the stories that only the two of them would know. It was as if both of them were protecting something, or avoiding it. And as time passed, and the Beatles became a myth, the real story between Paul and Ringo faded into polite interviews and rehearsed smiles. But underneath, something real remained. Something unresolved, because when friendship ends with a laugh instead of a goodbye, the silence is never quite complete. And just when it seemed the past had settled into dust, Paul McCartney would say something that cracked it wide open again. In 1998, Paul McCartney faced one of the greatest losses of his life. His wife, Linda McCartney, passed away after a long and difficult battle with cancer. She wasn't just his partner. She was his anchor, his creative muse, his bandmate, and the woman who helped rebuild his world after the Beatles imploded. When she died, Paul was devastated, completely unmoored. For once, the man who had written songs of hope and love and strength had nothing to say. The funeral, held in the quiet countryside of Sussex, was a private affair. Only family and the closest of friends were invited. George Harrison came, but Ringo didn't show up. At first, people assumed there had been a delay due to illness or a family emergency. But as the hours passed and no word came, the truth settled in. Ringo wasn't coming. Paul never made a statement. He didn't lash out. He didn't shame Ringo in the press. Ringo's team later said he was stuck overseas with prior commitments, that flights had been impossible, that he had planned to attend, but logistics fell apart. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just bad timing, but Paul didn't buy it, at least not entirely. But from that point on, something inside him went cold. It wasn't just the absence, it was what it represented. This wasn't the studio, this wasn't a band meeting, this was his wife's funeral. The woman he loved more than anyone else in the world had died, and one of his oldest friends couldn't make it. To Paul, that absence wasn't just a missed moment. It was the final proof that something between them had changed permanently. Ringo had always been the one who kept the peace, the guy who cracked jokes when everyone else was tense, the heartbeat in the back of the room. But in that moment, Paul felt abandoned. Again. And it wasn't about ego. It wasn't about a musical disagreement or a business betrayal. This was personal, raw, real. The man who had stood beside him through the rise and fall of the Beatles couldn't find a way to be there when Linda was laid to rest. And for Paul, that wasn't something you could explain away. It was something you remembered forever. After that, they continued the dance. Public appearances, tribute concerts, Beatles documentaries, but nothing could shake the quiet distance that now lived between them. And for Paul, every reunion only reminded him of who, hadn't shown up when it counted. It's easy to think of Paul McCartney as the rock star, the legend, the untouchable icon, but in that chapter of his life, he was just a man mourning his wife, hoping his oldest friend would be at his side, and when he wasn't, something in Paul hardened. Some friendships die loudly, others fade with time, but the hardest ones are the friendships that survive in name only, where the love remains, but the trust is gone. That's what Paul and Ringo became, still Beatles, still brothers, but not the same. And just when it seemed that distance might be permanent, Paul would break his silence once more. But this time, it wouldn't be with bitterness. It would be with something far more unexpected. To the outside world, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr had reconciled. Over the years, they shared stages again. They laughed in interviews. They honored John and George together. And for millions of fans, it was a healing sight. Two surviving Beatles, still standing, still smiling. But for those watching closely, the cracks still showed, because while the performances looked warm, the reality behind the curtain felt colder, more calculated. Their reunions weren't about friendship, they were about duty. The first signs came during the Beatles anthology project in the mid-1990s. Paul, George, and Ringo reunited to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The press painted it as a beautiful brotherhood moment, and on the surface, it was. But behind the scenes, tensions resurfaced almost immediately. Ringo was reportedly frustrated by Paul's need to control every detail, from the tempo of tracks to the final mix. George sided with Ringo on more than one occasion, leaving Paul feeling isolated in a band he'd once tried so hard to hold together. Even so, they made it through. But the dynamic was never equal. Paul was still the leader, the perfectionist. Ringo was the team player, the one who went along, even when his patience wore thin. In public, Paul always offered polite praise. He'd say Ringo had great feel, that he brought humor to the group, but even those compliments had a ceiling. During one appearance in the early 2000s, when asked if Ringo had ever surprised him musically, Paul laughed and said, "Not really, but he always showed up and did the job." That might have sounded friendly to a casual listener, but longtime fans recognized the dig. Paul couldn't help reminding people who he saw as the real architects of the Beatles' success. For Ringo, the tension came out in subtle ways too. When he appeared on talk shows or gave interviews, he rarely brought up Paul unless prompted. And when he did, his tone was often clipped, cordial but cool. He spoke at length about George and John, but with Paul, the stories seemed rehearsed, emotionally distant. Even in their joint appearances, there was something missing. Take the 2015 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony, for example. Ringo was being honored with a solo induction, and Paul gave the speech. He hit all the right notes, called Ringo one hell of a drummer, got the crowd cheering. But there was something in his delivery, an edge, a tightness, almost as if he was checking boxes, not speaking from the heart. The embrace afterward was brief, the eye contact fleeting. Behind the scenes, those who worked with both men say they were cordial, but never close. In studio settings, Paul was still the commander. Ringo followed instructions, played what was needed, and left. There were no long lunches, no reminiscing in the control room. They were professional, polished, but the warmth that once defined their bond had thinned into formality. Then came 2023. Paul appeared on a podcast that was supposed to be lighthearted, just a conversation about music, legacy, life, but halfway through, the host asked a loaded question. "Do you ever wish you had spoken more honestly to your bandmates before things ended?" Paul paused, looked down, and said something no one expected. "I think I waited too long," he said. "Some things I never said. Some things I thought didn't need saying, but maybe they did." The host pushed further, asking if he meant John or George. But Paul shook his head and said, "All of them. But yeah, Ringo too." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was honest, raw. For the first time in decades, Paul admitted there were words left unsaid between him and the man who'd been with him from Hamburg to Abbey Road. And not just kind words. Words of frustration, of disappointment, of sadness. "I think we drifted," Paul said. "Not out of anger, just time, distance. You stop talking about the real stuff, and suddenly it's too late." The podcast didn't go viral. It wasn't headline news. But for those who truly followed the Beatles' story, it felt like a moment of truth, because in those few sentences, Paul revealed what decades of interviews, tours, and staged reunions had hidden. He missed something with Ringo, and maybe, just maybe, he regretted how far they'd drifted. That comment changed everything. It didn't erase the tension. It didn't undo the lawsuits, or the missed funerals, or the cold interviews, but it cracked the door open. It showed that behind Paul's polished image and Ringo's easygoing nature, there was still a wound. Not a gaping one, but one that never fully healed. They weren't enemies, but they weren't the brothers the world remembered either. And maybe that's the hardest kind of friendship to lose. Not the one that explodes, but the one that quietly slips away while everyone else is still watching the show. Paul's confession wasn't just about Ringo. It was about what happens when history becomes myth, and the people inside it are too polite, too proud, or too hurt to say what they really feel. But time has a way of forcing truth to the surface, and Paul McCartney, now in his 80s, finally let a little of that truth out. And what he said next would leave fans stunned. In 2024, Paul McCartney sat down for what seemed like another harmless interview. The setting was casual, the questions predictable, until one moment caught everyone off guard. When asked about his reflections on friendship, legacy, and the Beatles' final years, Paul hesitated. He didn't smile. He didn't fall back on polished anecdotes. Instead, he leaned forward and dropped a line that instantly echoed across fan forums, headlines, and living rooms around the world. "You can forgive someone," he said, "and still not feel close to them." The room went quiet. The host, unsure how to respond, asked if Paul meant anyone specific. Paul just nodded and muttered, "I think Ringo knows." It wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, but it was real. And after decades of speculation, that moment confirmed what fans had long suspected. Whatever existed between Paul and Ringo today, it wasn't what it used to be. This wasn't about jealousy or fame anymore. It wasn't even about music. It was about something deeper, the quiet erosion of a lifelong bond, the kind that doesn't snap with one argument, but slowly dissolves through small absences, missed calls, and words never said. Paul continued talking, but his tone stayed low, almost reflective. He said that the longer he lives, the more he thinks about what wasn't said, the phone calls he didn't make, the walls he didn't break down. "You think you'll always have time?" he admitted. "And then you look up, and you're both in your 80s, still breathing, still smiling, but not really talking." He stopped short of blaming Ringo. In fact, he gave him credit. Ringo's a good man, always has been. He's got a big heart, but sometimes we just live too far apart emotionally. It was the most open Paul had ever been about their relationship. He wasn't angry anymore, but the sadness in his voice made one thing clear: forgiveness had arrived. But the closeness never came back. This wasn't the first time Paul had hinted at this distance. In earlier interviews, he'd talked around it, referring to some people in his life who drifted away or who chose silence over speaking up. Fans assumed he meant John or George. But now, with this recent statement, the message was obvious. Ringo had become one of those people too, and it hit differently coming now, at 82 years old. Paul has outlived John, outlived George. He's seen fame, tragedy, and everything in between. And yet, it's this quiet distance with Ringo, the only other Beatle still alive, that seems to weigh on him most. Because they were supposed to be the ones who lasted, the survivors, the final chapter of a story too big for any one person to carry. But instead of growing closer, they became distant figures in each other's orbits. Always near, never quite connecting. Even their reunions in recent years have felt carefully staged. During a 2022 charity concert in Los Angeles, Paul invited Ringo to join him on stage. The crowd erupted. The nostalgia was overwhelming. But those close to the event noticed the two barely spoke off stage. There were no long catch-ups, no shared backstage laughs, just a quick nod, a handshake, and separate dressing rooms. Still, Paul never publicly condemned him. He always chose his words carefully, but when asked if he missed the way things used to be, his answer was hauntingly simple: every day. It's not that Paul wanted Ringo to be like John or George. Each of them had their own space in his heart. But Ringo, for decades, had been the reliable one, the steady presence, the man who never needed the spotlight to hold the rhythm. When that steadiness faded and was replaced with polite distance, it left Paul feeling more alone than ever. What makes all this more painful is that Paul doesn't seem angry anymore. He seems tired of pretending everything's perfect, tired of smiling through strained reunions, tired of waiting for a conversation that might never come. And maybe that's what makes this latest interview so powerful. It wasn't about exposing Ringo or blaming the past. It was about finally telling the truth, that some friendships don't survive simply because you want them to. They require effort, vulnerability, and sometimes confrontation, things Paul, and perhaps Ringo, avoided for too long. There's no indication that a dramatic confrontation is coming. No fiery letters, no documentaries where secrets get spilled. That's not who Paul is. But in his quiet way, he said what needed to be said, and it landed like a thunderclap, because for the first time, Paul McCartney didn't talk about the Beatles as a legend. He talked about them as people, and in doing so, he revealed something more human than any chart-topping song or platinum record. The bond between him and Ringo was real, it was deep, and now it's distant. Maybe there's still time for that final talk, maybe not. But in 2024, Paul finally broke the silence, not with anger, but with honesty. And that honesty may have exposed something no tabloid or tell-all ever could. The Beatles weren't just a band, they were a family. And sometimes, even families don't make it to the end together. But this story isn't quite finished. Because while Paul has revealed more than ever before, one question still lingers in the minds of millions. Will Ringo ever respond? And if he does, what will he say? Share your thoughts in the comments below and click the next video on screen for another interesting story.